Welcome back to Civic. How about that? I, uh, I can't tell you how happy we are to bring this program back to you in person at this beautiful space, this beautiful new space that Camp House has. This is just a wonderful opportunity. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is a wonderful group of folks. I see a lot of familiar faces and some faces I've never seen before, so if you've never been to Civic, welcome. This is a wonderful educational program offered by the Chattanooga Design Studio. My name is Eric Myers. I'm the executive director of the Chattanooga Design Studio. I just want to recognize our staff who's here. Beverly Bell is with the Chattanooga Design Studio. She's an urban designer. And Lindsay Wilkie is with the Chattanooga Design Studio. Is she here? There's Lindsay. She's the urban design coordinator at the studio. And Christina Gibson leads this program called Civic, and she is in the back in the red. Christina Gibson. And that's us. You know, tonight I'll be really brief when I get to the program. First and foremost, I want to thank the Camp House for being an excellent host of Civic through the years and now as we return to this in-person event. Can't remiss but thank Lyndhurst Foundation for funding this program for such a long period of time. You'll hear tonight a little bit about what we've been doing with this program. If you've never been to a Civic in your life and it's your first time, you might hear a little bit about what you're missing, but you're not missing much because we've recorded everything. It's on a website. You could watch any one of these programs. But here's a little recap for you because we're really proud of what we've been doing. In 2018, we had a stellar lineup. We started right out of the gate with a really, really rock star set of speakers. And just as a reminder, we heard some really inspirational nuggets, if you will, or gifts from Ryan Gravel, who, Ryan, if you don't know, he was the inspiration behind the Beltline in Atlanta. And he went further than just talking about the Beltline as a piece of infrastructure. He shared with us that night the idea that infrastructure is so much more than just a paved road, a path, a street, a sidewalk. It's really a way of life. And he shared with us a really, really intimate detail of his life with the Beltline and how it has completely transformed he and his family's life. It's a wonderful presentation. And in 2019, Matthew Lister helped us really understand how urban design, and Matthew Lister, excuse me, let me stop and interrupt myself and say Matthew Lister is with Gell Studios, an international urban design firm out of New York City. He's headquartered in New York City. He had a wonderful presentation and centered around what urban design really, really needs to focus upon, which is our public life, and really turning on top of its head the way urban design has traditionally been practiced, which is buildings, space, and life, but looking at public life first, then forming space with the buildings that make that active public life. An incredible presentation. I'll just remind everybody, if you haven't seen it, at the end of it, he had us do a 3-minute meditation with photos from his staff from all over the world that were their expression of their public life. It was very moving. It was very moving. And in 2020, the shape of Civic changed. You know, all of the, we all knew that, right? We've all seen these screens, and the shape of Civic changed with that. But we kept rolling. We kept rolling virtually, and we had Akima Price as our last time that we were all together in the Camp House. And Akima reminded us of the 3 necessary components of meaningful engagement. She talked and really, really hammered in on what it takes to have meaningful engagement to build a park as meaningful as the Anacostia Park in Washington, D.C., and that is intentionality, connectivity, and relatability. And so, building on this legacy tonight, returning to in-person, again, I'm really happy that we're all here together, and I'm really happy that we're here tonight with 2 of my esteemed friends that I've been working with for the past year on a West Side Evolves plan. These are 2 very, very powerful women. I can't say enough about them. So tonight you're going to hear from Ray Parks from the EJP consulting team out of Washington, D.C., and Erica Roberts. Ray?
Figure out, am I working now? Thank you. Well, good to see so many faces. As Eric said, my name is Ray Parks. I work with EJP Consulting Group, and we have the great privilege of being hired by the design studio and the city and the housing authority to help facilitate this planning process to come up with a new vision for the West Side. And so tonight, I am going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned over the many years of doing this work and how they manifest themselves in the work that we are doing here locally. And my colleague Erica is going to focus on the local piece of this, all right? I do want to give a shout out to my colleague Kathy Carton, who I cannot see. Hi, Kathy. And so she is a real critical part of this team, along with Jewel and Ron. Lots and lots of shoulders that support us in this effort, along with the Housing Authority and the city. So first, let me tell you what I'm not talking about. I'm not presenting the West Side Evolves plan. That is for Saturday. The reason we can't go into that plan tonight is because we've promised the community that they'll get to see it first. So please come to our block party and our celebration on Saturday to get more details on what that plan is. But tonight, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and some of the rewards and some of the ways in which we have addressed them in the work that we do. Quick question. I'm curious, for those of you in the room, how many, just a quick show of hands, how many of you have actually lived in a community that has been the subject of a major planning or redevelopment effort? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, so that's a healthy number of folks. So you can probably remember some of what you felt, some of the uncertainty, some of the anxiety that you might have felt, some of the excitement potentially, right? As well as the opportunities, right? So we ask this question because the way that we plan and the work that we do is informed by starting with an appreciation that change is not always easy, particularly for families who have lived in the neighborhood for a very, very, very long time. And a lot of the neighborhoods in which we work and we do this planning effort are economically distressed. Housing sometimes is deteriorating. There has been lack of investment in these neighborhoods for some time. Sometimes they're isolated. And sometimes the education gap or the income gap is quite severe compared to the rest of the city. And so we start off simply acknowledging that the neighborhoods in which we are working, sometimes the starting point is a lot more challenging, even though the goals and the aspirations for the families who live here are exactly the same as if you're in any other neighborhood, all right? So how did we get here? This is just a quick slide to tell you a little bit about the work we have done and our firm, EJP. We are a national practice, and we have worked all over the country, and we work primarily in the affordable housing space. Our work principally starts off with working with government or housing authorities who have an affordable housing asset that they need to reposition. But that asset exists in a neighborhood, and that neighborhood exists in a city. Families live here, and we are starting off making sure that we approach this work guided by a set of principles. So the lessons that I want to talk about tonight, without getting into the details of any one neighborhood, are the following. History really does matter, right? Understanding the baseline. What are we starting with? Where has this community been? What are the challenges? Where are we today? If we do not pay attention to history, then when we are talking to residents in neighborhoods about something that's really important, and they're talking to us about trauma and pain, and we didn't spend the time to understand that history, we are not doing our jobs well. So to get to meaningful engagement, it means we've got to spend the time understanding what happened before. And in many of our communities, especially Black and brown neighborhoods, right, that are predominantly residents who are Black and brown, there's a history of displacement or trauma or any number of disruptive activities that are still residing in people's memories today. And so the West Side is no different. You've got a highway that came through that interrupted what was once a thriving neighborhood. And so being clear about that history and some of the decisions that happened before us, so that we can talk about planning in a way that is honest and acknowledges the pain and the past is important. Another important tool that we've learned about how we engage communities meaningfully, strength. It's easy enough to talk about all that is wrong or what's missing or crime or dilapidated housing or any number of things that are necessary to turn around a neighborhood. But we have learned that even though all of those things are true, it is essential that we acknowledge that there are tremendous strengths and assets in our neighborhood, and one of the most important ones are the people who live here now and have lived here for a long time. Because if you imagine raising a family in a distressed neighborhood where there is high crime or limited opportunities, and you're still able to succeed and thrive, that's a tremendous amount of resiliency. And to be able to start conversations with that lens, right? That it is not a deficits model. We can acknowledge that there are deficits, but we need to build on these strengths. So that is one of the essential tools and lessons we have learned, and it informs all of the work that we do. We also spend the time to understand the assets in the neighborhood. So there could be physical assets, there could be partners, there could be a church group that is investing in something. There could be a program that is delivering an after-school set of training for folks. But what are those strengths? And do residents and neighbors also see those as strengths? Because it's one thing if we think something is a strength, but there's not community consensus that those are strengths, then, right, we all of a sudden will have a disconnect here. Another important lesson that we have learned, and this is really, really important, is being honest and clear about where residents and community have the opportunity to influence the direction of a plan versus decision making. Oftentimes those two things get mixed up, right? That community input can shape the direction of a plan, can shape the outcome of a plan, but if residents and neighbors are not decision makers, we have to say that, and we have to be honest about that. And sometimes they can be decision makers too, but sometimes they're not. And what we find, if we're not honest upfront about influence versus decision making, then we end up with folks who are then disappointed about their engagement opportunities, or that folks will say, well, I asked or suggested this, or this, why is it not in the plan? Or we have any number of negative outcomes if we're not honest upfront about influence versus decision making, all right? We also have found, and some of these are just sort of self-evident, right? Nothing here that I'm talking about is magical And they're not always easy to do, but they're essential, right? So this idea that we have to listen actively, right? And that means sometimes we are going to hear some hard truths that are going to rub very raw, right? But we have to hear those because authentic engagement means that everybody has a voice, every opinion matters, and that we have to create the space and the table that all of those voices are welcomed, even when they are sharp-elbowed, when they are negative, and when they are glowing and fabulous. And I think sometimes if we're not careful, we shy away from those hard conversations. But plans are better when we hear those criticisms. Plans are better when we listen to those stories about how harm was done back in the day and how promises were made and not kept. So how is this going to be different, right? Very important. And the other thing is about transparency. Yes, you can make up a plan in a room and come out with pretty pictures and maybe talk to 3 residents, right? Yes, you could do that, but in all honesty, that's not really a community-centered plan, right? And so being able to, throughout the entire process, be open and transparent along the way, including when you have to change direction. So we can lay out the best set of critical path milestones, the best set of suggestions, imbued with input from community, and something happens. The issue isn't that something happens that changes the plan, because plans change. The question is, how do we communicate with residents and community about how the plan is evolving and why? Because it's trust building is important as well to get to a successful outcome. And so that means we have to be honest about what is happening and what we are learning along the way, including when we have to change directions. Consistency also matters. What I'm saying as a lead planner needs to be consistent with what our client is saying, what the city is saying, what everybody is saying, so that there's no daylight between the planning members, the client, and the community, because it creates opportunities for bad actors to then insert all kinds of... Am I being taped? Yes. You know what I mean, right? So, consistency. And that includes when things are not going well. Planning is not easy, it is hard. It is hard to sit across the table from residents who are worried about the future and are worried about, will I have a home tomorrow? We have to be able to acknowledge that, and some of the ways in which we get around some of that hesitancy is around being clear about the kinds of promises and the commitments that are ironclad. So in the West Side Evolves planning effort, for example, one of the ways that we dealt with some of this early is the promise that every existing affordable unit that was standing when we started this project would be replaced, right? All of a sudden, the anxiety level comes down because now you're not worrying about, am I gonna get displaced because this is going to be a community only for rich people when it's done, right? Then we can have a conversation about, okay, if the baseline is these givens, right? What do you want it to look like? How do you want to experience the community? Now, what kind of amenities do we want to integrate into this planning effort? How do you imagine yourself here 5 years from now, 10 years from now? that really does matter. And that is one of the lessons that we have learned. Collaboration. We cannot do this work by ourselves. In fact, sometimes we are not, as planners, the best people to have certain kinds of conversations. So one of the things that we have learned, it matters what the team looks like. It matters that you put teams together that reflect the communities in which we work. It matters that we recruit local team members too. Eric is one of our local team members here who will talk about that experience. Because sometimes I need Eric to be the one to lead a particular conversation because Eric is going to be received differently than if I lead the conversation depending on who the audience is. And we're very intentional about that. Intentionality is one of the themes that cut through everything we do because, let's be honest, it matters. If I'm a resident and if I'm trying to get a resident to participate, the person who knocks on their door and asks them to come out and participate, if that person looks like them, right, and they trust them, right, they're more likely to come out, right? So engagement becomes then this personal relationship because Miss Sharon here went out and personally asked her neighbor to come out, and Miss Sharon is a known asset in the neighborhood and she's trusted. So the intentionality around how teams get built is important, and also how we then translate the technical information in such a way then that everybody with different education levels are able to then consume this information in such a way that we then can honestly say the participation was meaningful. Because it's not enough to just have people show up at a meeting, right? Can you honestly say you understood what we just talked about, right? And sometimes that means we are unpacking different pieces of information in different ways. Sometimes it's a focus group. Sometimes it's a one-on-one. Sometimes it's a Zoom meeting. Sometimes it's a workshop or an open house. But all of those are intended to build on each other so that at the end of the process, one, the opportunity was created to engage. Because remember, we can't force anybody to come out, right? But we need to make it so attractive that you want to come out and be a part of this planning for the future of your neighborhood. And by the way, when I talk about recruiting allies and collaboration, that's not just with residents, right? It matters that we're building partnerships with city government. It matters that we're building partnerships with elected officials. It matters that we're building partnership with nonprofit providers and clergy and everybody, that whether you have an asset or you have resources or you have labor, volunteer legs, the menu of possibility ranges, but it does matter that the tent is big and that we are also having those who are friends of the project as well as critics of the project at the table too, because if your critic is in the circle, the odds are better that you end up with a product that is better because you are listening to critical voices. And if you exclude them, you're just going to be fighting later on as you're going through the entitlement process, for example. All right? Early wins. One of the things that we find really, really powerful, it is not enough just to plan for the future. 5 years out, 10 years out, folks live in communities today. There are any number of needs and supports or opportunities that folks are struggling with today. So how do we very intentionally bake in to the process early wins? And early wins can be something as simple as put up a bus stop. put up a street light, a park bench, pave the sidewalk so everybody can see it. And that is responding to what residents and community tell us, right? And I called some of those out because in our West Side Evolves planning process, these are some of the things that folks have said, and that's in addition to all the big things that are going to take 5, 10 years to pull off, right? But it is important to start delivering because it begins to change the narrative around my voice isn't being heard, or when is something going to happen, or it's a waste of time, right? And specifically, resident and community-led efforts where small amount of resources in the hands of residents to go execute on something that's tangible, we have found to be very, very powerful, and it helps to build momentum over time. Money, resources, and time. We cannot pretend that this doesn't cost money. But how do you invest that resource, right? We have found that, yes, there are very specific things you need to invest in, right? Data-driven solutions, very important. But also investing in non-traditional ways of engagement, right? That means hiring artists who then can work with the community to help have a dialogue about what the community's strengths, assets, and opportunities are through a very different lens. It also means then that you have an adaptable approach so that when COVID hits, you can continue a planning process, which is one, I would argue, one of the strengths of this West Side effort, that this project really occurred during a pandemic, and at the same time, we had really significant participation. We had a resident participation rate in the survey of over 80% for the door-to-door household survey. At the neighborhood level, closer to 50%. We've had any number of artist-led touches along the way, right? And so, but that requires investment of resources and time and a client that is flexible. Because let's be honest, you can lay out the best plans, life is messy, and it happens, and all of a sudden we have to change direction. And so flexibility in the process is important. And you know, we've sort of put up 2 plans here. We have found it typically takes a good 12 to 24 months to have a plan that is grounded in community voice, community vision, and then begins to set it up for implementation. Because if all we do is have a plan that sits on the shelf, what's the point, right? So the way we come at this work is about how do we get started. Early wins we talked about, but then once planning is quote unquote done, what is the implementation pathway? And so teeing up the resources while you are planning, we have found to be an effective way that supports engagement, but then begins to deliver early. There are many, many, many more lessons, but I don't want to spend all night talking to you. I am going to have Erica come up. She is one of my newest friends that we have met here in Chattanooga. And in some ways, it's a little bit like serendipity because we actually had another artist in mind. And he so graciously bowed out because he's doing all kinds of other things and couldn't commit. And he said to me, "You have to meet this woman." And we met, and the rest is history. And one of the things that I am especially proud about is the idea was, we know we would like to have art-led engagement, but it was non-prescribed, right? It was go imagine, go dream. We did say, however, but it needs to connect to the plan. It cannot be disconnected and the timeline is something that doesn't work for us. So she's going to talk a little bit about how art has been imbued in the West Side planning effort and what the outcomes of that look like. You want me to? Okay.
Wow. Am I good? Can y'all hear me good? Hey, lovelies. Verdi Lee Roberts. That's my grandmother. I have tissue because I'm a big baby. She is 98 years old, and she lived in the Elks. Before that, she was one of the reasons or the introducing person for me coming to the West Side as a young person. So it would be this ritual. Every Saturday, Friday night, I'd spend the night. My mom and dad had a crazy job that they needed a babysitter. And so I always chose my grandmother because she cooked. And so that's where I chose to be. And with her, she had a ritual on Saturday morning. And that ritual was getting up early, fixing 1 cup of coffee, making me coffee, but putting more pet milk in it than coffee, giving me my allowance, and we would go to the Red Food store that was up on the hill. I would also ask very earnestly and very sincerely that if I could go upstairs to Zare's because I wanted to go buy popcorn. If I was good, it would work out. It didn't always work out. However, but this place had so many memories for me. Walking into Zare's smelled like popcorn and had those same gold lights like Target that made you look beautiful, you know? And so as a kid, that was a great place for me to want to go, but it was also a part of that ritual. My grandmother worked for Chattanooga city government as a social worker. She was one of the beginnings, right? On the ground kind of folk, right? Now it's all, computerized. But for her, she had to go foot to different churches and collect those checks and ask them and constantly ask them. And at one point, there was a campaign, which is where this is from. You can go back from that. Because I have to tell y'all, anybody got their camera out, when that picture come up, I'm about to see y'all. But she was part of this fan program for elderly who didn't have air conditioning, didn't have adequate air conditioning. So I grew up with this influence of helping. I grew up with this influence of being a servant, but I also grew up seeing this community. Give y'all a minute if y'all want to take that in. What a mess. 7th grade Erica, going to Northside Elementary and coming to the West Side to play. My friends were in the West Side, and so that's where they were. And this was me coming out here. I despise that picture so much. But it speaks to the young girl that I was at that moment, but also it speaks to the innocence of me in being introduced to the West Side in this way. And also it occurs to me that probably that young girl didn't realize that she'd be standing here either, which is a dope thing. When the West Side project came up, I had some reservations, honest ones, right? Not knowing that 30-something years later, I would be coming back to the West Side as a caregiver for my grandmother. Not knowing that I was going to be in the house with her, not knowing she was going to be as stubborn as she was. The whole plan was for her to move, and she was very obviously evident she was not going anywhere. And so I realized that I was going to have to be there to help, but she also was going to be helping me in a weird way. I had a sense of embarrassment in a weird way, because at that time, there was a lot of negative things that was happening in this particular community. And it was scary. But the one thing that overshadowed all of that was the fact that there was such strong spirit. While I lived in the Elks, I didn't live in the courts, I could still feel that strength, that pride for this community, right? There was people that left the community that were having big jobs and they were coming back to visit. There was West Side reunions that were happening every September. I knew for a fact that, okay, this is something that I might be able to be involved in. But I had questions. Where does an artist fit? Sankofa. That is the spirit of going back to get it, right? So that meant that baseline that Ray spoke of, history, having to go back to history, pull it, be honest, be vulnerable, be true, good, bad, and indifferent, and use it, right? Meaning that no matter what the story was, being open about it, being real about it, not over talking it, not allowing it to fall by the wayside. So that meant confronting urban renewal, slum clearing, the language of the newspapers as they talked about the residents there. I was so tired of seeing some of those words. Mercy. But that was something that we had to honestly confront. And so how do you do this? When you know that a community is changing or about to change, the things that change immediately, the history falls to the wayside, the name changes, and no one knows anything. How could we preserve? So for me, the baseline was this is history. How do we preserve this? How do we make this history show through art with the voice of the community? And this was interesting. This was very interesting. This West Side map speaks totally to the connectivity, right? When I looked at this map recently, I saw also the need of talking about the 4 points and what this meant as far as artists were concerned. You can see he's actually using some of that shape on there as well. Shout out, Andrew. I wanted to be clear, though, that as we were approaching that history part, we also had to be clear about who needed to be at the table, what kind of artists. That's something interesting. Can't just have anybody. I got crayons, but y'all don't want to see what I draw. But you want to have someone there that can do the work. So that meant coming up with some amazing art that would speak from the community. The Imagination team was formed. And it was myself, Charlie Newton, Andrew Travis, Ben Banks, Rita Hubbard, and April Corbett. Now, these are Avengers, art Avengers, right? Superhero artists. Because Andrew, when I hired him and looked at him, I didn't know what I was going to tell him to do. I knew one thing. Your art has to be inspired by the community. It has to look like it. And so the first thing we began working on was Kwanzaa. Anybody familiar with Kwanzaa? And the 7 principles, these are amazing principles, especially if you're working in Black and brown community. It's amazing village building principles. And so we had 7 of these principles, and these were some of them. But that was the beginning of how we could use art. From that point, it became even more interesting as to how the voice of the community could be heard with those oral histories from Ben Banks. We listened to those. We listened to Miss Sharon intently. She told us what we needed to do and what we didn't need to do, and I was clear about it. But it was able to help me take that information from Miss Sharon and the other ladies and the other gentlemen from the community and turn that information back over to our team. Flagpole is important. The courtyard was important. Those were things that were learned simply through me, us, talking about art. It takes away all types of inhibitions. Art can speak in places that words don't need to be. Art doesn't need translation. All it needs is a willing eye and an honesty. I don't ask anyone to trust me. I ask them to trust the art that I'm able to create because that's all that I have. And if you're able to trust that art that we create, then you'll see exactly what this meaning is. One important part of this entire process, we have community advisory group meetings, right? And it was an amazing idea to have Charlie Newton do artistic note-taking. That's something that's, Chattanooga was kind of stepping up, was kind of be special, but I loved it. What that meant was every meeting, Charlie was doing something similar to this in every meeting. And it was a reflection of what was actually happening. We weren't sure how we were going to use those oral histories. We weren't sure how we were going to use the Kwanzaa pictures. We weren't sure how we were going to use this. But one thing for sure, they had purpose and they had meaning. And we knew that they were important. The memory room, I spoke of that earlier. So that was where we actually had those oral histories. And this was Charlie's rendition as he peeked in at us. And what he saw was a vibrant seating space that was welcoming, that was open. And it helped us even more when it came down to the deeper conversations that needed to be had. Those conversations of, so y'all putting me out. So y'all, is that what you're trying to do? The real questions, the questions that everyone would have. It made it easier. Art has that transporting and that fair honesty that allows you to touch someone that may be porcupining. You may not be able to touch them. This is an art piece from Andrew that we used to actually communicate. COVID was not letting us do anything, period. But we were able to come up with this amazing postcard to pass out. And it was amazing to get them back and see what the words were that they added. They added words like community. They added words like diversity. They added words like life. They added words like creativity. They added all of these words that we want to put into this. Intentionality. And a shout out to Chattanooga Design Studio, because in the beginning, it was required to have an artist or a creative on the team to start off. That means that they were already ready to put intentionality in the cake. They were ready for that. And this is what you get, that planned out process. This space here is my community. I walk past it. I live there. Sometimes I sit and talk. Sometimes I don't want to be noticed as someone as a part of the project. I just want to hear them. And the one thing that I did know for certain is that they're ready for that change. We just have to help them. Based on history, we have to be fair. We have to be true. Knowing what happened, we have to be fair. We have to be honest. And that's a part of that conversation that I'm listening to. And as a creative, it can't help but bleed over into the art. How does artists work? So I'm a weird person. This is probably what my brain looks like most days. Thank you, Beverly, for getting a snapshot of my brain. Wow. So I was trying to think, because I do this a lot, with other places. How do you work with artists, right? So you want to have, and you have the actual handouts too. But what you want to do, where those X's and there's unknowns, you add in what you are working on. You add in the spaces that you are looking at. But the whole goal is, how can an artist work with an org working with the community? And it has to have that intentionality. It has to have the org plus an artist times an intentionality squared by creativity. It has to. I'm not a math person, but it just makes sense to me that way. But you equal out to having a planted process that works. And this is a working in progress. I thank you guys for sitting here with me and keeping me from not bawling. Thank you guys. It has been amazing to work on the West Side Project. It has been one of the most rewarding, I must admit. These individuals, again, the Avengers of all, Charlie had his space with those absolute amazing note-taking. Andrew stepped in to create art that was inspired by the community. And that's not an easy task, That meant he has to look at the bricks. He has to look at all of the angles and pay attention to all of the colors and all of those things and be able to translate that into art. Ben Banks has an eye that tells stories. And so his pictures are most profound. You have to stop and actually take them in. April Corbett, I cannot speak more highly. April stepped in at a moment where we needed a specific type of artist. I needed an artist that was okay with gluing. I needed an artist that was okay with maybe wheat pasting. I needed an artist that was okay with 8-foot boards coming to her house. I needed an artist that was going to be super receptive to all of this work that we took in. We had pictures from the community. We had pictures from the artist. We had paint. We had history. All of the things. And it was very important that we had this type of artist. And then to round it out with Rita Lorraine Hubbard. If you have an opportunity to check out her website and look at her books, she is the resident narrative writer and historian. And again, I can't speak more from Ray that representation matters. So we all black, and it's all real, and we're all serious. And to have that representation walking through the streets with the community that we look like, it gives a sense of trust that may not have been there before. The art piece that April has created with all of the things that I just talked about will be officially unveiled on Saturday. I can't tell you, if you don't come, I don't know what to say, but you need to be there to see this. It's not something that you can just breeze by. It's something that you're going to have to honestly stop for a moment and breathe and take it in. It is a 10-month culmination of emotion through history, emotion through present time, and deep triumphant emotion for what will be. Thank you again. Did I go over? Okay.
Thing is she. All right, so, Andrew.
Let us see.
Can everybody hear me? All right, cool, perfect. So going back to like the structure of the face made me think of the map. And then I thought I wanted to add some streets, but I was like, no, let's focus on people because that's what this is for. It's not just for just talking about the community, it's the people that live there. So I wanted to at least give a representation of the people being in the structure, talking about light bulbs being more so ideas, just kind of the thought that goes into community, how community could be shaped, how it can be viewed. Of course, you talk about the economics that go into it. Yeah, that's just really picking up on everything that everybody was talking about. You got popcorn, kind of looks like clouds, you know, kind of represents clouds, but the colors really go back to like male and female because it's not just one group that lives in a community. It's a collective. Going back to family could be individuals. Going back to the eyes, the blue made me think more so of just kind of like this, not tears, but we're talking about who had to move due to urban renewal. It's only about 3 people. And ironically, there's 3 lines that happen, so that's not intentional. That's just how things happen. Purple, that's more so kind of like royalty, still kind of like in that kind of the cool family. I didn't want to go 2 sets of blues, but everything is representation of just kind of how it made me feel when I heard certain words or emotions that were spoke at the time. So everything that I pick is based off of emotion. Now this red that I introduced would be going back to a brick color, still going back to the community, the heart of it. I'll probably add some more layers just to build the face, but that's a little quick synopsis of my thing.
So I think, you got a feel for how the West Side Evolves effort has evolved, and we are delighted, 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 delighted with how it has turned out. When you start off this journey, you know, right? As Erica said, you know, we sort of, you know, to all these folks that we are bringing in, and you sort of unleash folks. But one of the things I will say, though, is that, and I think if you come to the celebration on Saturday, please come. It's Grove Street, it's in the community. We will be unveiling the plan, and in addition to that, all of the art that's been created. But one of the things I particularly am proud of is the idea that you simply create the space and the opportunity and let folks who are content experts go and do their thing, right? There's some guardrails around certain things that we will need back, but you will see some really amazing things. We believe the plan that is being unveiled on Saturday reflects the community's aspirations and their dreams, and it's a framework plan. It very intentionally looks at not just the bricks and sticks elements in the neighborhood, but it also looks at a plan to support families. How do we help families thrive? So please come, and we will open up for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
What is your process for taking? What is your process for taking very big concepts in the planning world and breaking them down to something that somebody who doesn't speak this planning language can understand?
Okay. So there is no one way, right? And so this is one of the things that we make sure we're clear about the audience. Who are we talking to at any given time? So if we're talking to the planning department or the city or technical folks, right? There's a different way in which we might have that conversation. If we are talking to residents who are not steeped in that language, that technical language, then we have to use the language in which they can understand. So the burden is on us to make sure we are continuously translating technical information in ways that are digestible to the audience we are speaking to. And sometimes, right, that is where our artists come in, because they might be talking, they may be the ones having the conversations around something that might otherwise be technical. But it sometimes is just a series of questions, right? So, you know, in the industry, if you're not careful, you use a lot of jargon and technical language, but it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be. So again, this intentionality around knowing your audience and who you're talking to and adapting all the time. Again, we still have to be consistent, because the technical team, the planning and zoning folks, the city, they need to hear and walk away with the same information that the residents who might have a different level of understanding of the technical information, so that we don't end up having daylight between what the resident who may be at a different level of technical knowledge heard versus what somebody else heard. So it's less of an art, it's less of a science, I should say, but it is really continuously listening to the community, adapting, translate. And I use the word translation because translation is not always about translating in languages, right? But it is translating technical information in understandable ways. All right? And pictures help a lot, right? Sort of conveying things visually, because some folks are visual learners, right? And repeat, repeat, repeat. Sometimes we gotta say the same thing 10 times, right? Or even sometimes you'll have a meeting and 90% of everybody has heard it before, but you have one person in that meeting this is their first meeting. Well, we've got to help them leave that meeting fully informed too. So repetition is not a bad thing in this case. All right?
So I am curious about engaging with populations that are maybe more transitory than residents. So, for those who don't know, I'm the director of the camp house here, and I'm very interested in the future of this neighborhood. We've purchased here, and we want to have that impact that is supportive of those who are experiencing homelessness, which is the greatest, if there is a resident of this neighborhood, that's who it is. That's an incredibly transitory population. You could have a meeting this week, and then a month from now, they won't be there. So what is that like to engage both with a transitory population, but also with legacy business owners? So neither one of which are true residents in the way we typically think.
For the Chattanooga effort, right, we don't have a lot of legacy business owners. And we did have a fixed population that was our primary target audience. So in some ways, it was easier because we had a target population, they were living in a fixed area. But if I look at some of the other work that we have done elsewhere, right, that involves families who are a little bit less fixed or less stable, then surveying, right, was one of the ways in which we get to folks. And so, but that means the survey effort looks very different because you have to go find people to survey them, right? And this, remember we talked about allies and champions. Well, who are the other partners who are interfacing with the populations we want to reach? So is that a soup kitchen? Is that a shelter where folks come in to sleep at night, right? We have to recruit allies and partners that can help with that. The other thing is trying to find people wherever they are. We have to go where people are. We're lucky in the West Side because they're here. But you've got the planning effort and the engagement effort adapts to the population that you need to engage with. And honestly, partners. And then also, if we can find some of these folks that we can then hire onto the team, they then become embedded, and then they become ones that we then have lead that charge. And that's where the resource comes in, the flexibility comes in, because sometimes the timeline needs to change. Because all of a sudden, if we can only reach a handful of people, well, that's not meaningful engagement, right? So working with our clients to adjust, adapt, because the reality of the situation on the ground requires it.
Thanks, Ray. I'm going to tag on to Justin and Matt's questions. So a lot of times these projects, like this project will be, go over many, many years. And I mean, we hope that this will take off and that the plan that is unveiled on Saturday will take legs and will grow and will be implemented immediately. But there's a great chance that it will be many, many years, right? And so what happens then, to the transient population, but not just transient homelessness, but just people move, right? People move and change. And then how do you continue to have that community engagement from a planning process to the implementation that might be 5 years later? And then you have a completely different set of residents who are like, wait a minute, I didn't say I liked this. What is this all about? So just would love to hear your thoughts about that.
All right. So there are a couple things in that question that I'm going to unpack them. One of them is around, if we use the West Side effort, the Housing Authority has these fixed populations. And so one of the elements of this planning effort, there is what we refer to as an original population that are grandfathered in, that they are known, they are tracked. Part of this is because one of the sources, the housing authority is going to go after some federal dollars as well. There is a fixed focus on, there's an original population, they were the subject of this planning process. But because we know life happens, right? Mobility is not a bad thing, right? People move for all kinds of reasons. If you grandfather then in this original population and we track them, and you agree to be tracked, emphasis on you agree to be tracked too, because if you just say, don't bother me, I'm good, I'm going to North Carolina, I'm done, I never want to come back, that's okay too, right? So what we do in these efforts as we transition to implementation is we make sure there's a fixed roster of here's everybody who's grandfathered in. If they move, but when they exit, again, with the West Side Evolves effort, it's a little bit easier because it's a known population, right? Then they have the opportunity to say, I wish to return. Part of the effort is this idea of a right to return, a right to come back home if you decide to leave. So that's why we focus on the front end of defining this eligible original population. Now, the second piece of your question is neighborhoods are dynamic, so people move and so on and so forth. We cannot be planning indefinitely, right? So there is a fixed plan that says this community at this time with the city and all of these partners agreed these were the priorities. Now, because planning evolves, you are tweaking, refining, adapting, markets change. Look, we had COVID last year. In 2008, we had a recession, the housing market collapsed, right? So planning is not fixed. So there is continuous refinement, and the value of having a phased implementation is that each phase builds upon the next. And as long as the implementation stays true to the values, the goals of the plan, the fact that things change within the plan is not as important, except to the extent that it's still consistent with the goals and the values of the plan. And secondly, we communicate those changes. Remember I talked about earlier, change is gonna happen, but we have to commit to continuous engagement for the folks who wish to stay engaged and communicate why things are changing, opportunities to have continued input, but we do acknowledge that we can't plan forever, right? But we can refine, we can tweak, and create opportunities for continuous engagement. But the wholesale plan doesn't necessarily go away. And yes, the West Side Evolves plan is going to take many years to execute, but we're not worrying about the many years. We're worrying about where do you get started? What's the first phase? Build momentum. What's the second phase? Build momentum. And then the pace can pick up if we can align the financing in such a way that big chunks of money comes in rapid succession, because financing ultimately is going to drive the pace of implementation. But we're already identifying the first phase where it's going to start. That allows for building momentum. But thank you for that question. I'm going to go, okay, here and then.
So you mentioned as part of establishing a baseline for the community that you were able to say you weren't going to displace, but potentially like replace the buildings that are already there. Did I hear that correctly? So how did you, like, how can you assure, that seems very unique, right? In urban planning as far as like I can remember other plans and things. So like how were you able to say that you're able to do that? Like, do you have the funding to do that? Do you have the city's buy-in to do that? I was just really curious about that piece of it.
Okay. So that was a values proposition, right? The commitment to replace all the existing units, the affordable units, was a values proposition. The housing authority, the design studio, and the city agreed on that commitment. And that was important to get out the gate with that because, like I said earlier in one of the lessons, is if you, commitments like that, right, ease anxiety about, will I have a place to come back to or to stay in and age in, right? So that is a business proposition, right? And so the goal is to get all of our communities to find a way to make those kinds of commitments and honor them, right? Yes, it requires funding, lots of funding, but that's the piece we solve for after we have these baseline assumptions that are locked in. There are certain things that are just not movable. That was one of the ones from day one. We were delivered a charge, one-for-one replacement, mixed income, mixed use, community amenities that you can walk to, right? Improved safety. There were certain givens, and what we have found increasingly across the country, because the pressures of affordable housing, they're not getting any easier. So increasingly, one-for-one replacement, and especially if the original site is a public housing site, it's actually more normal now than in the past, because, and certainly under this administration, you will not get approval to redevelop a public asset without that commitment anyway. But that was an important values proposition to start the conversation, and that was decided on with a group of community stakeholders, including residents. Yes, ma'am.
I'm from the west side. I lived in Grove Street Courts. Your organization, Chattanooga Design, you're EPJ. Okay. Are y'all here to stay? Or will y'all be here for 4 or 5 years and out, half do the project? Or are y'all gonna ride this out? You understand what I'm saying? We done had too much shucking and jiving and ham, sham, scam mess. Come in, get money from the city or the county or whoever the money's coming from. I don't even know. I don't care. I just want, if you're gonna do out there, do right by them. Do right by them. Now, when I was there, the school was open. It's no longer. Urban renewal come through. You know, I done seen too much in too many places in this city, in the black neighborhoods that come in. And I noticed down on the river, you could go down there and fish. Can't get down in Blue Goose Hollow. You got it almost locked off where I can't go through the fish. You know, where I used to just cut through behind Sherman-Williams and go down. No, you can't go down in there no more. So now they inching back in the hood. You want it out, now you want back. All I want somebody to stay. If you're gonna come in here, get money, stay in here. Now, this is my first visit to this. I'll be there, sir. To what time? You never told that.
1 to 5
Okay, 1 to 5 on Grove Street.
on Grove Street. You look for the big old balloons and stuff.
No problem.
All right.
But I'm just really speaking this now,
Yeah.
and I'm not there now. But I'm not too far from it.
Yep.
You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So I can come back home.
Yes.
See, you can't, but I can. But, you know, I just want y'all to stay in here and work with the people. If you're going to do this, if the housing authority is saying that they want a change, the people that own the Elk say they want a change, what's this up on here, over the one facing the interstate, Ridgeway, I want them to do right by them. Not just some of them, do the whole community right. Once you come past 24, 27 going that way, that's where up 12th Street, everything should be in a different idea. Main Street, all the way to the back, to the Elks. Now, let's start.
I'm going to say amen to that. And actually, I'm going to give a shout out to the previous administration in here. Carrie, I'm just going to put you on the spot. The previous administration made a commitment to this effort, represented by previous staff. The current administration has honored that same commitment and are committed. The design studio is not going anywhere. All right? The housing authority is not going anywhere. Come out Saturday. And the comment you made about the whole neighborhood, you will see that in the plan, because even though the housing authority only owns the housing authority asset, this is a neighborhood plan. So it looks at not just the redevelopment of the housing assets, but it looks at neighborhood improvements, retail, services, improved streetscapes, mixed-use opportunity, safety, pedestrian experiences that are better, finding ways to connect to the waterfront. So please come, all right? I think you're going to be happy. And yes, this is a long haul, but the intent, we start just one piece at a time, one phase at a time. I'm getting a time signal, so if you have a last minute, just burning question, this is the time. If not, I'm going to hand over the mic to Eric.
Thank you. Another round of applause for Ray Parks. Please. She's amazing. I'm so privileged to have gotten to know Ray and to have worked with her this year. Another round of applause for Erica Roberts, please. Erica is super special. We are fortunate to have Erica in our community, right? How about Andrew Travis? Another round of applause for Andrew. My man is an up-and-coming artist. Keep an eye on him. Watch for his name. I'm telling you one thing, he's on fire. So, again, in wrapping up tonight, thank you for being here. This was so meaningful. This was so heartfelt. This was a great evening. The energy in this room was unbelievable. Mark your calendars if you have your phone on you or you write it down on a piece of paper. September 30th will be our next Civic, and it'll be another in-person event. I'm crossing my fingers, my toes, my eyes, all of those things to make sure that we can get that done. We will have Rhonda Lee Chapman. She is the Director of Equity for the Trust for Public Land. The Trust for Public Land is a national organization that works across this country to preserve open spaces and build open spaces in cities across the nation. Rhonda is another dynamic woman working in this space and doing this work, and I can't wait for her to share her work with you. She will also do what we're thinking of right now is discussion in the round. We'll see how that comes out, but it will be her dialoguing with some local folks about building community together, okay? Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful night. See you September 30th. I hope so before that, though, right?